Hi, my name is Bogdan Vera, and in this presentation I want to talk about player-driven audio creation in Dreams, which is Media Molecule's latest PS4 title that came out earlier this year. So our latest game, Dreams, is a user-generated content game, which means that within the game, players can make animations and games and art and music and sound art and mix these disciplines together to do all kinds of stuff we haven't even thought of yet, potentially. And when you're done making this stuff, you can publish it to what we call the Dreamiverse, which is an in-game media platform with stuff like recommendation and trending, and you can comment on people's creations and remix and collaborate and fill the game's universe with creations. And all of this is done within a WYSIWYG editor, which means there's no compile times or exporting or importing of stuff. You kind of just make things in edit mode, and then you hit play, and you're in the game. And you can hit publish, and it's gone out to the community immediately. So let's look at some example bits of content. These are all made by me, just for fun in my spare time. So as you can see from a pretty small selection there, the stuff you can make is quite varied. So I kind of want to touch on what are the underlying principles that kind of drove development on this game, and the idea that maybe this will help other people with similar hopes to make player-driven content generation. And the things that really stand out to me are things like flow and performance, which basically is the idea that instead of focusing on editing through sliders and all these technical tools and putting in numbers and moving vertices and polygons around, you would focus on kind of using your hands to just perform and create fluidly in some way. And we didn't know how to do this originally. And another very big factor was this idea of integration and generalization, the idea of combining tools as much as possible to prevent this fragmentation of the toolset into different disciplines. And also to make creation in the game feel fun and not make it feel like work. You don't want to feel like you're at the office or like necessarily in a game studio. You want to do it from your couch. So that's the kind of challenge, is make a fun game that you can play from your couch, but also lets us, Media Molecule, create our own original games in it with great music and audio, in our case, because our own games are made in Dreams. So some ideas that went towards achieving those goals are, from the earliest days, we didn't use polygons or textures or UV mapping or any of these things we normally use in other games. We went for signed distance fields, which are a form of voxel technology, which allowed the player to kind of just sculpt with their hands in the world in 3D space. And we championed motion control for that purpose. So we really went hard on motion control. Just to avoid people getting stuck in this cage of polygons where they spend ages fiddling with parameters. And we wanted to have a simple UI that doesn't have all these menus and pop-ups and filling the screen with UI. Most tools have a screen for the game editor where you see the actual game scene, but then like screens upon screens of hierarchies and sliders and code. But the problem is most game audio tools are aimed at professionals, and audio is kind of this abstract and intangible thing that also causes people to feel this sort of reverse elitism where they're like, I've seen what that is, it's not for me. You know, I'm not a musician, or I'm not an artist or anything like that. And we want people to feel like they could do those things in the game and move past those feelings. And Dreams had been in development for a few years when the audio tool development began. And some of the ideas that were being floated around at the time were that it would be somehow playful, maybe jumping on mushrooms in the levels makes notes in some way. Maybe you can play the level by pulling a door, and instead of squeaking, it sings or plays a melody or something like that. I don't know. All these ideas were quite vague, but there was a general sort of ethos there. And we kind of had to figure something out that was along those lines, but actually was more useful for us to actually also make content. And remember, on the PS4, you've really only got the Dualshock 4 motion controller, the normal controller that you generally have, and the Move controllers that are these two sticks, these wands you can move around in 3D space and have 6 degrees of freedom tracking. And you don't have mouse and keyboard, which means we have to somehow make best use of these control systems we have and find their strong point. So immediately there are these limitations that have to be somehow turned into boons to our development. So in the early days, we were thinking, like, if you can sculpt trees with the controller, why not sculpt music? So the earliest ideas were inspired by, graphical scores and Xenakis and stuff like that. Music that is somehow shaped, or maybe it's based on colors. Maybe we can rephrase music theory as motion and position and shape, remove the abstract stuff. And then motion control input is, in theory, pretty good for motion-based music. Music performance generally is a motion and gestural-driven thing in real life. So here are some early ideas. Maybe you can have pitch versus time with these squiggles, which is basically just a smooth piano roll. Or maybe you can have these squiggles in 2D space. Maybe the different colors and shapes represent different sounds. And we went with that originally, and this was quite powerful for making this kind of abstract, surreal music where you don't care too much and whatever comes out is cool. But the stuff you make with the sort of tools is very interesting, but maybe a little bit too academic for a general sort of gaming audience. And also for audio content team, we wanted to make also traditional game soundtracks, so this was not good enough for us. Although in the end we basically did exactly this in a different way. So there was this dissonance between making a fun audio experience and making it powerful enough for us to make AAA quality audio experiences. But also we can't just ship an audio workstation like the ones we normally use. We can't just put what we normally use in the game. It would be ridiculous. Because we have a small dev team, we had 2 audio programmers when our team was at its highest numbers, and you're running a game. There's a low audio memory. You can't run gigs upon gigs of sample libraries, and then you'd have to tutorialize that. You can't ship a game that's an audio workstation, even though we did in the end. So yeah, there are many of these nights spent in deep thought about what should we actually even do, and people got quite dogmatic about whether we should ship a DAW or not with our game. So kind of going back to what a game actually needs, you need the basic aspect of sound playback, asset management, sequencing, dynamic and linear music, implementation of sound events, spatialization, localization, mixing. All of these things would have to somehow be part of the system and done by gamers on their PS4, which is hard. But we had some breakthroughs in those early days, which were kind of building on those early gesture ideas. And it was this idea of sound strokes and these effect fields. So again, maybe you have these strokes in 2D space, but to make them a bit less abstract, you combine them with these effect field zones, which when you drag these strokes through those zones, they gain various properties and various effects. Maybe the filter cutoff is moved around, or I don't know, the pitch changes. So you can have an effect field that adds +2 to pitch or something. And as you go in and out of it, you would do a pitch bend effectively. So it's kind of like a preset interpolator where these effect fields can be +10% to volume, 50% time stretch. They can do multiple things, and then you kit bash them together to kind of make your own performance space or your own instruments, and then you do actually just perform with your controller through these fields. And this proved to be a pretty interesting and cool and powerful idea. So here's a short example of performing with effect fields and the controller. And now I'm going to record some of these gestures to a metronome. Now we can hear the recording. So sound strokes are this directional music data that exists in a 2D space, and every stroke is related to a single voice in our synthesizer, which is actually an instance of the whole synth that we've built. And yeah, you kit bash these effect fields, and it's fun. It's a bit like sound sculpting and makes you think differently about music making. And I think this is kind of a cool thing we could actually add to our normal tools. Imagine if in a game you could have a synthesizer engine that can do a variety of different things, and then you're just going to move your sound effects or your music around in that space. And it allows some interesting techniques, like now you can have automated offset of the strokes in that space from logic in the game, where they move around in algorithmic ways. Or you can put LFOs on the strength of those fields, so now they can oscillate or vibrate and apply their effects rhythmically. Or you can take these effect fields and put them in the world, where they form zones. So now when your sound goes through there, they'll be transformed. So they're kind of like the Swiss Army knife of how you make music and sound in Dreams. So as for the Dualshock and how you perform with it, it was very interesting to develop for it as an instrument, because that's kind of what we wanted to do with it, make it an instrument that can do a lot and be mastered. You know, quick to pick up, hard to master. You can go far with it. So we went with this idea of like the 8 buttons in the front of the controller. They control 8 notes. You've got tilt left to right for octave shifts, up to plus and minus 2 octaves. The touchpad can do bends or semitone shifts. So you've got a thumb available on each hand to kind of do these bends. You've got R2, which is the right trigger for volume, expression, and L2 for spiciness, which is a bit complicated to explain, I think, in this presentation. But it's a bit like having an effect field attached to your trigger. So it can apply effects, basically. And then crucially, because the DS4 has gyros, you can point as you perform through this 2D space. So you can spend time mastering this input to learn techniques that are actually quite high concept in a way. You know, scrubbing granularly, freezing things, pitch shifts, reversals, chopping. It turns into an instrument, all these things that we normally spend ages tweaking with automation and in advanced tools. But these tools were designed with sound design in mind as well, within the exact same framework. You never go into a different tool for sound design than you do for music. And the sound effects that you hear and the voices in the game are all internally actually playing these exact same sound strokes, and they can be put through the same process of positional parameter blending, which kind of turns the game into a sort of motion-driven Foley box, where instead of, again, dealing with chopping and editing lots of little sound material, you spend more time actually playing with the sounds and with the effects that are available. And a lot of the things you play with are not post effects, they're different ways to chop up and manipulate the original sample. This is an example of various sounds added to a freeform 2D zone and performed with the imp character. It's kind of recording a gesture moving through all these different sounds with various levels of granulation and stuff. And the gestures are being recorded now. Various Foley recordings. So now the gesture is playing back. It's basically a form of performance capture. Now adding the recording to a timeline. And now I'm going to drive the timeline's playhead with a sine wave. So it's moving back and forth, and it's now driving it dynamically. And the wire could have been coming from some game logic or something. So it's going back and forth to the recorded stroke or gesture in the piano roll view as well. Now adding some effect fields to the timeline, because you can put them in the timeline as well. So some pitch changing. Plus 24 semitones with a fade in and fade out to the effect. One of the tricks we have in the game that I think would be quite useful in other tool sets is this idea of ranged parameters. And here on the right you can see a tweak menu for a sound, which could be an instrument as well. And it contains all of the different tweaks for granular synthesis, like grain length, interval, grain panning, pitch, and so on. And every time you play the sound or trigger a note with the sound, it'll pick the values that are in these sliders. But you can see some of them are pulled apart. You can pull these sliders apart to set a randomization range. So every time you trigger it, it'll pick a value from that range. So of course for sound design this is very useful because it changes the sounds every time you play them. But also for music, it's great. You can get these very, very interesting, random, dynamic, almost IDM breakcore, glitchcore sort of stuff very, very quickly from this. You can also see some of these sliders have a hashed region. And what that is, that's something we call the spicy region. And that's a way for Logic or the player to shift the parameter set from the normal random range to a secondary random range smoothly. It'll just blend or lerp to that different range. And you can do that by performing it with the left trigger in music mode or just driving it from Logic. So every sound has like an alternate fire almost. And we found this pretty powerful, especially because our sounds have this granular system built in. All the effects are built in. All of the sliders support this, and we love just messing around with randomization and triggering sounds in different ways. In this example, I quickly add randomization to pitch and granular synthesis parameters on a weapon sound. Now these two-dimensional position strokes can also be viewed in a time versus pitch style piano roll, and it has this lerp motion between them. You just press L1 and touchpad and it changes the view modes. It's like a multimodal interface, and this enables a unique workflow of switching between the two views to compose and edit in different domains. If you want to be in this flow or performance-driven mindset, you stay in freeform view to perform or change effects. And if you want to be in the more editing or composer mindset, you switch to the piano roll. And you can select notes in either view and find them in the other to move them. And the 2D shape is preserved when you move or clone things, which allows you to basically make like a gesture, like a prototype gesture in freeform view, and then reuse it in the piano roll view by cloning it or moving it, which is a form of automation that's intrinsic to those music notes. So here I'm going to perform some notes through the different effect fields. Bit of pitch bending, some LFOs, and I've recorded that, so now it's a gesture that plays back. Now I go in and I make a chord out of one of the notes. And you can see the transformation between the two views. And the chord that I added. And this playful automation makes use of the motion control on the controller. So in essence, it's a system that's heavily colored by the tech available in trying to make use of the technology. And it allows all these novel techniques that are kind of hard to even really quantify. It might make for a good talk on its own, or maybe kind of like a NIME paper or something. But what I like about it is that advanced music and audio synthesis ideas can be explained to users in simple terms. Like I have a degree in music tech, so I can talk for ages about granular synthesis and phase vocoders and all this kind of stuff. But even kind of advanced producers and stuff who make music, they don't necessarily understand those ideas always. In Dreams, they're boiled down to just colors and shapes you can use. So anyone can just mess around with these very powerful audio tools, very advanced audio techniques and ideas in this very simple parameter mapping that's actually quite deep and powerful. So at this point in development, we had this cool instrument you can play with a controller. It did all this cool stuff, and it was fun. But having a guitar is not enough to make a piece of a track, a modern production. So for that, you need some sort of way to sequence music, some sort of workstation. And we were quite dogmatic at the time to keep that performance-y vibe and not try to just add an audio workstation into the game. And that went on for a long time. But what it turned out was that at the time, the animation team was developing this timeline tool for the logic and the animation in the game. And what we ended up doing is we ended up turning that into our timeline and integrating all the audio systems into the animation timeline. So it just became the timeline. There isn't a different screen or tool in the game you go to do music and audio. There isn't the audio tools. They're just the same tools as everything else. And this means that you can have this tool that's understood almost by everyone. If you know how to use the timeline and gadgets and animations and all this stuff, you almost kind of know how to use the music tools in a way. You can easily mix clips and do a bit of mixing and stuff. So the final version of Dreams integrated the audio engine with the logic timeline, and it functions quite organically as a digital audio workstation. What was difficult was people in the animation world, for example, have very different requirements than sound designers. So it took a lot of back and forth and this sort of tug of war to reach a version of the timeline that everyone didn't hate and everyone kind of liked. And I think in the end, we ended up there. For example, one big contentious point was in a normal music timeline, which is mixed with an audio mixer, you might have like solo and mute buttons. But those things are kind of a little bit alien to animators, and they kind of hated the idea that there would be this thing on the side of the timeline that they would never use. And in the end, we have it, but it's something you can turn on or off. So that's an example of like, we can't possibly put all the tools in there. We have to pick the ones that like are useful to animators. And in the end, it turns out like solo and mute are useful to almost everyone, because you can mute layers of animations or logic. And this means that skills can transfer between disciplines. You can have animators that change up the sounds a little bit, or sound designers who change the animations a little bit to fit the sound design, all in the same tools they normally use. So the system became pretty fun when this tool unity was achieved, where there was only one editor. It all works with the controller motion input with consistent input metaphors, achieving that kind of playful performance-y approach as much as possible. We still have editing. It's still there. You can still do editing. But we champion the playful stuff. And this means there's no compile times, no imports, no setup time. You do as much as possible inside the game. Now, it's a lie that there are no imports, because we did import all of our audio libraries. But generally, we spend 99% of our time inside the game. And this allows very fast prototyping that basically leads right into development. For example, you might have a meeting with the entire team of sound designers, animators, game designers, and so on, where you decide to change something, and you do that change inside the meeting while you're playing the game. Just enter edit mode, change the thing, save, and that idea turned right into the final product in that meeting. And at Media Molecule, people don't use PCs or whatever to edit the game or code and then the game to test it. They do everything in the game. So all of our designers and sound designers and everyone else just sits there with their controller and does everything within the game. It's a pretty cool workflow. Now let's talk about the Dreams audio engine for a little bit. Every voice is fully granular. This was our second kind of big breakthrough. We decided we're gonna build the aesthetics of the game into the engine from the beginning. Strong aesthetic choices, which means that the game kind of sounds granular. There's a lot of stretching and scrambling and repitching available at all times, so a lot of the things in the game do that. But it's expensive, although we spent a while optimizing it. But it was important for us to get as much juice as possible out of that synthesis method. Even though we explored other ones like phase vocoders and stuff. Granular is much more useful for coloring the sound as opposed to getting realistic stretches or something. The music in the game is always live, kind of like MIDI, so the music is all stored in live data. And the user creations are stored that way in the cloud, which means that basically, because the audio samples are on the disk, all of the level downloads, because of course you have to download the data from the server, all of those downloads are super fast because you're barely downloading anything, which means the game loads everything really quickly. So we have these sound gadgets in the world, which are like the game level form of a sound, which update at 30 hertz with the rest of the game update. And they spawn audio tracks, which have the kind of panning stack and the audio rate playhead sub-update. And then you've got all these voices that are spawned by the tracks, which then the voices spawn grains. And the kind of weird thing we decided, we're not going to have a mixer UI anywhere in the game. We just didn't want to burden people with the metaphor of a mixer. So actually we have a fairly fixed pipeline of effects for each voice. There's no sends or plugins or inserts, it's just fixed. And that worked really well for us, really. We never felt like we lacked that too much. Now the issue with building all your tools in-house is that you risk your users in the office to ask you for features, and then those requests for features will propagate all the way through production and through everyone else, and they'll come back to you as Jira tasks or whatever. And if you're not careful, you'll just implement all these features, and you'll have no time because everything's everything's urgent. So you'll end up shoving them in all these menus, and before you know it, the game doesn't look like a quick and fun tool. It just looks like menus upon menus, overflow menus. So we learn to aggressively say no to feature requests until we can fit them in a more general feature. Sometimes those features turn into more general game features as opposed to audio ones. They fed into animation or logic. So we tried to prioritize this creative flow above everything else. Anything that would break that flow was rejected quite aggressively. So some takeaways from this, in my opinion, are things like putting aesthetics before tech design. That worked for us. We designed our own tools. Not everyone can do that, but I think it worked well for us. And sometimes you can be liberated by the limitations that you accept if they serve your creative flow. Try to somehow include prototyping inside your main tool. Again, it depends on whether you have the resources to do that. But it decreases fragmentation and it just makes everything work a lot more fluidly. And integrating tools, like I said, as much as possible. Have tools that your animators can use as well as your sound designers, for example. I personally like the idea of using shape and space. This is not just for dreams or sound design. I would like to see more instruments that include gesture and motion as opposed to just using the good old keyboard and piano rolls and stuff. And treating sound design more like performance makes you think differently, and it's just a bit more fun than fiddling with knobs and sliders and stuff all the time. And also, of course, the music and audio tech can be fun for a very wide audience if we can find the words and metaphors to popularize it. Now, the things that often went bad were whenever we interfaced with external tools. So remember, we decided to make all these tools for ourselves, but for some reason we thought, actually, things like localization and just the batch content processing and VO and all this kind of stuff, we know how to do those things. We'll use our normal tools. But it turned out that actually that was the big bottleneck. The big problem was interfacing with those tools. We spent way too long on that, and maybe we should have actually designed those tools as well. And actually, ultimately, in the game, as a player, you can do localization for your audio. Now, the tools are out, and our community is using them, and we have mountains of feedback to go through and triage. And again, we have to fight feature creep, just like in the studio. But in the future, we want to add audio export. At the moment, you have to record a video of the game to get music out of the game. We want to add sample packs. We've just released a pretty big sample pack with orchestral instruments and stuff. OSC support, it's already possible to drive the music tools with OSC, but we want to add more. And of course, because Dream's music is symbolic, it's great for music information retrieval and recommendation and generation and analysis and all that kind of stuff. And bringing Dreams on stage. We've played shows with Dreams. You can bring your PS4 on stage and do full music performances. Thanks for watching this presentation, and hope to see you in Dreams.
you.